Namaste. Subject for today is an esoteric area of the state of no thought. Deeper movement into the subject shall encompass areas of psychoanalytic and Eastern spirituality, which we would be covering in 2 episodes. Our guide for the discussion shall be none other than our subject expert, Mr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, Mr. Vaidya.
Namaste.
So, what if we start with if a state of no thought is possible at all?
State of no thought is not only possible, it is the cornerstone of Indian spirituality, philosophy, and psychology. Equally so for much of Eastern philosophy, spirituality, and psychology. State of no thought, however, is a rare experience. It is not a birthright experience. By virtue of being human, we all have certain birthright experiences that we all have by default, even if we don't do anything. Similarly, we have powers which are birthright powers. The power of a human to acquire a human language, the power to understand, the power to feel. These are our birthright powers. But just as you have birthright powers and birthright experiences, there are areas of power and experiences which you can have only if you cultivate them. So there are cultivated powers and cultivated experiences. Experiences earned by hard work, self-development, and in Eastern spirituality we call it sadhana. And one of the rare experiences which you can earn, or if you are lucky and you have done something in your past lives, it happens to you by grace or by virtue of past life accumulation, those are separate issues, but generally you have to earn it. And that one of the rare experiences is the experience of the state of no thought. And this state of no thought is actually a goal for many spiritual systems. It is a cornerstone for all the Eastern spiritual systems, no doubt about it. But in some spiritual systems, like for example, you take Osho Rajneesh system, there what they call as enlightenment is actually a state of no thought which can be established on demand, in perpetuity or near perpetuity. So when we look at the state of no thought, it can be a goal for certain systems. In certain spiritual systems, it is not the goal, but it is the beginning of the first of the many goals. So for example, if you look at Sri Aurobindo's system, it is a 4-step system. Step 1 is the attainment of state of no thought. Step 2 is experience of psychic inside the heart. I mean, deeper than the heart, inside the chest, deep inside the heart, the psychic. That is step 2. That to experience the psychic and bring it in the front. Step 3 is to experience oneness with the universe. The oceanic feeling of oneness with the universe above the head. And step 4 is to bring all the supra-mental powers above the normal range into the life, body, and matter and transform oneself completely. So it's a 4-step process. Step 1 is state of no thought. Step 2 is experience of the psyche. Step 3 is experience of universal oneness. And step 4 is to bring down higher powers and transform oneself. So this, in this system, state of no thought is the very important beginning. Now there are other systems where you only have 2-step process. A state of no thought and then a state of universal oneness. And that brings us to the idea of 2 broad categories of school in spirituality: the schools which talk about transformation and schools which talk about liberation. Those schools which talk about liberation, they only talk about how to get oneself out of this karmic cycle. And for them, the state of no thought and oneness is enough. They don't go into transformation. But those schools which want to transform oneself and the life around us, who believe this world can be transformed, they go into two additional things: bringing the psychic in the front and transforming everything in the light of the psychic, and bringing powers above the mind into the life and body. So this is how, so this is how various spiritual schools are. Now, the way to achieve is usually done by Sakshi Bhav. So there are various flavors of this state of no thought. We'll go into it slightly later, but just to make a first hand mention of it, you can have a state of no thought where you are only in an observing position, a Sakshi Bhav. And often in this state of no thought, the characteristics are this. One, in the state of no thought, you have high awareness. Two, you have a feeling of bliss. Three, you have a feeling of only being an observer. Or alternately, you can have a feeling of dissolution in a negation or a dissolution without negation. If you have a feeling of experience of dissolution with negation, it becomes almost a feeling of experience of nirvana, the Buddhist nirvana. Or
samadhi.
Samadhi usually is referred to the experiential unity with oneness of the universe.
Okay.
Right? Some people do refer to samadhi in the way you are referring to, where all negating experience is also referred to as samadhi. And if you do that kind of definition, it becomes one with nirvana. But the classical Vedic definition usually is to denote the oneness with the universe experience as that of samadhi, which is very near to the feeling of lay. But in lay, there is a flavor of negation, whereas here the oneness with the universe has a flavor of like being one with everything and beholding everything.
Okay.
So the difference is in beholding and oneness experience versus an experience of all negating absolute. And all these experiences are true and valid. And this takes us into this whole area of flavors of enlightenment. And this is what I have dealt with in my book, Effective Enlightenment. What are the flavors of enlightenment? And I think we have done a video also on that before, Effective Enlightenment. Now, so the point here is that what we say as state of no thought is not only one state. You can have various flavors of this state of no thought. So the state of no thought can be accompanied by many other characteristics.
Right.
So there can be a state of no thought where it is experienced as all negating absolute, or a state of no thought where you are only aware of everything, that's it, or a state of no thought where you are one with the universe, or a state of no thought where you feel yourself are dissolving away, or a state of no thought where it is just pure consciousness and nothing else. Even bliss is not experienced, which is the Jain equivalent of what they call Kevalya, where even the bliss is not experienced. It is such intense pure awareness. And this is where an important question comes in, that many people say it is a state of celebration, that it is a state of simultaneously a state of emptiness and celebration. or a state of oneness and celebration, or a state of observation and celebration, or some people say it is just a state of pure awareness. Now this brings up a very important element, that if in that state, which we say is a state of no thought, if there are no thoughts, how do you even know that you exist and that this state is there?
Right.
So the critics say that the knowing that I exist and I am experiencing the state of no thought, these two themselves are thoughts. The first thought is that I exist.
Is it not the awareness?
Yeah. So this is where the counter questions come. That if you can report a state of no thought, it means that two things have happened. One, you had a thought that you exist. And second, you had a thought that you not only exist, but you are experiencing a state of no thought. And this is where the problem comes of confusion between knowing and thinking. If you say there cannot be any knowing without thinking, these arguments would be correct. And this is the classical Western view, that there cannot be any knowing without thinking. But the Eastern view is different, that you can have various kinds of knowing, and only one kind of knowing is knowing through thought, although it may be the most common way of knowing.
Yes.
Immanuel Kant, in his critique of pure reason, addresses this point. He also takes up the classical Western position, and he says the process of knowing cannot overleap the experience of knowing. Meaning, the stages of first you register a stimulus. Stimulus is interpreted as sensation. Many sensations are put together as a perception. Perception is worked upon into conception. Conception is worked upon into knowledge. And this process of knowing, you cannot overleap this process and know anything. This is what Immanuel Kant's position is, and that of Western psychotherapy and Western thinking also is. But the Indian thinking has a very different take on this. So we say there are different kinds of knowing. This is only one kind of knowing. For example, there is a knowing by intuition. There is a knowing by intuition, which is not by normal thought, which is not by normal sensation turning to knowledge. There is a knowing by identity, where somehow we identify with something and we know. There is a knowing by enveloping something by our consciousness so that it yields to us its knowledge. And there is a knowing by virtue of our existence, in which we access intuition in a very subtle way. And then there is a knowing by getting into the inconscient heart of things, into the law itself. And then there is a knowing, right, where we know something from the center in a supramental way, which is not what you and I can do. But Sri Aurobindo and Mother did report that this supramental knowing is a very different kind of knowing, where you know something integrally by being in its center, something that we have not developed. For example, if I want to know all about a state of anger, there is a physiological aspect to it, a neurological aspect to it, a psychological aspect to it, an energy aspect to it, a karmic aspect to it, many angles to it. So usually I would think individually each of them and then try to consolidate it into what I call integral or holistic thinking. But I do it step by step. And once having done it, then probably I can go into the center of it and look at whole as one. But this would be a labored step by step process. Instinctively, I cannot go into the center of anything and know it integrally, which is possible in supramental thinking, according to Sri Aurobindo and the mother. So we
Sir, I
see
have a
that.
question here. When you're talking about different kind of knowings, what if we say there is a kind of a fundamental knowing to everything? For example, if this is my hair strand, it doesn't have a psychic ability. It doesn't have a psyche. Okay. It just has a body and energy to it. Right. But if it leaves my body, then also fundamentally it has a knowing, its DNA, dead or alive, whatever, would behave in the way of a human hair, and mostly it would be my according to my body type. So
True.
isn't there a fundamental knowing to everything?
Yeah, so this brings up actually a much larger area. You have opened up
Okay.
the area of knowing being fundamental to everything in existence. And that brings us to the idea that there is consciousness is everything in existence, because knowing is a property of consciousness.
Yes.
So knowing presupposes consciousness, and therefore this consciousness in everything. And that is then taken up by the Vedic idea that not only there is consciousness in everything, but everything actually has been created out of consciousness. And consciousness is evolving out of everything. And therefore, the plan of the universe is actually a cyclical working out of consciousness, which goes into something and comes out of something. Uh,
Right.
Virgil puts up in a very good poetry. He says, "Flight of the alone to the alone."
Okay.
So that
True.
sort of creates a cyclical, denotes a cyclical journey of the universe. Coming back to where we were, that it is experientially clear, although you can didactically keep arguing about it, that when you experience a state of no thought, you know very clearly it is not a thought. It is pure awareness, and the awareness knows it exists, and it knows there is no thought. Because you can see around and you don't see any thought. You don't think that I have no thought. You see around and you don't see any thought. And the two are different. I
Yes.
think I have
And it
no
can be
thought.
the transition also. It can be the transition also when you are in thought and you're slipping into no thought zone. And once again, when you're back into your thought world, there is a sudden realization, oh, that was the time period of an hour or whatever in the meditation or otherwise, where there was this transition in between where there were no thoughts. But actually, there was no thought at that time.
So when we say the state of no thought, it is not that we have a thought that I have no thought,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
rather we look around and we don't see any thought. Now this
Hmm.
makes it very clear experientially. Now this is something which cannot be resolved by argument. It's an endless thing. People will keep arguing and believing whatever they believe till they experience. But it has been experience of hundreds of people in India and in the East, and there is no doubt about it. It is a rare experience which you realize by sadhana and by evolution of the soul. It is not something which is available to everyone, very aristocratic in one way, but a goal of most of us. So this creates an idea of difference between knowing and thinking, that you can know
Hmm.
without thinking. And Beyond also refers to it in a slightly different way, where he says we have thoughts awaiting thinking,
Okay.
which means there is some sort of knowing, a very intuitive knowing, but that thing is not fully processed. It is still in the beta stage.
So
From a distance, we
prior pre-thought.
Yeah. So he says the most unprocessed material is the beta, then it converts into alpha, and the alpha material is available for dreams and fantasy, and then it becomes into normal thought. So there are degrees of processing of the psychic material. But when something is in the beta, from a distance you can feel the flavor of it, although it is not thought out yet. Yet there is something which creates some sense of faint effect, some sense of recognition of something existing as psychic material with its own flavor. So what Bjorn calls thoughts awaiting the thinker. Sorry, thoughts awaiting the thinker. You can also call it the psychic material awaiting the thinking process. So one element here is that we should be clear that experientially knowing and thinking are two different things. You can know at least these two things, if not anything else, that you exist and that there are no thoughts by virtue of seeing around in a psychic way, of course. And then we have another important criteria here to clarify. When we say no thought, we mean no conscious thoughts. But what about cerebration? What about autonomous nervous system? What about the unconscious mind? Can thoughts go on there? Possibly yes. So even when we have no thought, we experience peace, we experience bliss, we experience emptiness in the conscious mind. But at the unconscious level, unconscious mind may still have thoughts, which over a period of time will get calmed down. And people have experienced it, that they have experienced a state of no thought and relaxation and taken it so deep, even while they are awake with eyes open, and they have taken uh, the the graph of the brain, the electrical graph of the brain, okay? And that has come to be below, okay, average levels of excitation of a thinking person, and in some cases has come so low that officially the person should be dead.
Dead.
Okay? But the person is not dead, he is just so relaxed. So the unconscious, not only the conscious thoughts can go away and there can be a state of no thought. Unconsciously we cannot know, okay, by definition of the unconscious, but unconscious also does reasonably calm down, and a substantial part of unconscious gets possibly into a state of no thought, and below that the autonomous nervous system will still have cerebration. So we have to also clarify here between cerebration and thought. So we are referring to, when you say state of no thought, we are referring to state of no conscious thought. It may still have cerebration, it may still have some unconscious thoughts, which in certain deeper states, if you deepen the state of no thought, you can start expanding the state of no thought first into parts of the unconscious and then into parts of the autonomous nervous system. In extreme cases, yogis have reported even cessation of autonomous activities. That is a state of no thought expanding even to the body, where except for, I think, heart and lungs, possibly most other organs almost go into hibernation kind of situation. Now that would be an extreme esoteric thing. I have met a person whom I trust. He's no more now, but he used to report, I have not seen it myself, but he told me that he has experienced these states more than 10 times. Let me not say 10 times, but at least many times. It may be more than 10 times because he used to go to Himalayas for 25 years. So it may have been more than 10 or less than 10, but many times he has experienced. I don't exactly recollect the figure. That is not important, but many times he has experienced it, and he would go into it consciously through a particular process with ingestion of a particular herb, which is available in Himalayas and prepared in a particular way. So these are very esoteric ranges of state of no thought, where it deepens into the unconscious and then even in the autonomous nervous system. But I would keep our discussion limited to state of no thought representing only the state of no thought in the conscious mind.
Conscious level.
Because this itself is esoteric enough, and the other two, they are like ultra esoteric elements.
Actually. So when we're talking about all these different knowings, and when we're talking about how to be thoughtless, how people have, reached that place, there is a lot of new concepts coming up, like, mindfulness. So though they're very westernized concepts, so mindfulness or observer ego in Western psychotherapy is a movement towards this state of no thought. Is it so?
Uh, state of no thought is achieved by and large through some degree of observation. Usually, first we create an observer that observes the activity of the conscious mind, and what is observed undergoes usually a sinusoidal wave. It increases in, let me not call sinusoidal wave, but a wave. It increases in intensity and then starts going down and it ceases. This is the fate of what is being observed. Now, this observation process is a process that leads usually to a state of no thought. There are other processes also to go there, which we will make a mention of. But this is usually the processes of observation, usually. Now, this process started in the West, first with the biofeedback mechanism, where people started observing, first becoming aware of their organs, observing their organs, trying to control it as far as possible, and trying to almost talk to them. For example, if you have high heart rate, you become aware of your heart, you become aware of your high heart rate, you try to control what usually is in the autonomous nervous system and outside of our control, but you try. And you almost talk to your heart. At times you change your breathing patterns, at times you change your sitting position, and over a period of time somehow you develop a connection where what was classically called autonomous nervous system function comes slightly in the domain of volition. So this is how it started in the West, and this almost led to the conclusion that as though different organs in the body or different systems have their own consciousness and you can talk to that consciousness. So this was how it started in the West, the whole process of observing the part of oneself, being aware of it and trying to then talk to it or communicate our understanding, our goals to it. And this observation of the body was then put in mindfulness into observation of thoughts and emotions. So the biofeedback movement is like a father movement to the mindfulness movement. And in the mindfulness movement, definitely it's a very good movement because it's a concise and a limited version of what in East is a very developed method of self-observation called Sakshi Bhav, or a full technique is called Vipassana. And many people have referred to by different names. Krishnamurti used to call it, J. Krishnamurti used to call it a choiceless self-awareness. Usually it is called Sakshi Bhav or Drashta Bhav. Now the same logic is being used in psychoanalysis in two different ways. It's very interesting. Psychoanalysis always is thinking about our emotions. So in a way, the intellectual observer was always there, right? Trying to make the unconscious conscious, right? Trying to understand the logic of emotion, trying to infuse logic into emotion. What Freud said, where id is, there ego should be. That's the goal of psychoanalysis, right? Where id is, there ego should be. What is unconscious should be suffused with the light of consciousness. So there was always something which was working on something. So that something which was working on something was a kind of a intellectual change agent, an intellectual observer, an intellectual change agent. But this agent was inside of the experience. So it was called the participating ego, but this participating ego was an intra-experience observer. It was in the experience, but within the experience, it was looking at something which was troublesome. So it was an intra-experience observer. Now, if you bring it out and you look at the whole experience as such, you look at it from outside and this becomes a classical Eastern observer, the Sakshi. And this
So
is,
there the therapist becomes the Sakshiva
yeah.
because
So
he is
this,
the one who's witnessing the entire process
yeah,
outside the body.
but we want to create it inside the patient's mind.
Hmm.
The patient's mind, there are two kind of change agents. The participating ego, who does part observation, part change function. And a very important
Right.
element of that participating ego is the defense work unconsciously and consciously done. So we strengthen the participating ego also because we want strong defenses. We want mature defenses. So if somebody is doing projective identification, we want him to move to repression. If somebody is doing repression, we want him to move to suppression. Somebody is doing
Right.
suppression, we want to let him go and just manage by conviction. So we want this movement to happen from immature defenses to mature defenses by strengthening the participating ego. So this has been the classical way of psychoanalysis. Now recently we are talking about observing ego, where something is coming out of experience and observing that whole thing. And this observing ego is very much like the Eastern observing ego. Now, this observing ego will inevitably lead to the state of no thought because people will start experiencing gaps. The difficulty
Right.
is this state of no thought, this observing ego is very temporary because people believe it is rare to create it and it cannot be maintained for a long time. It's a very high energy, high awareness operation, goes off very soon. So, and we don't know how to create it. There is no technique in psychoanalysis to create it. We just wait for luck that interpretation should work, containment should work, healthy unconscious mind, part of unconscious mind should work, and somehow we get into this state where the observing ego can arise and look at something. So both this participating ego with part observing function inside the experience and the observing ego outside have come into psychoanalysis. If they persist more with the observing ego, they will start experiencing gaps in thoughts, and that will be a proto experience of ultimately getting into a state of no thought. Now, one
Mhm.
element here additionally we have to add, there is something which is called a stoic nature, which is very common in Western philosophy. Now, in stoicness, you can have a participating ego who is who experiences equanimity in the middle of experiences. So there we are strengthening the ego
Okay.
strength to experience everything without getting disturbed. Or you can have a stoic
Okay.
element where you are in an observing status, not inside the experience, but observe it from the outside, and yet you are stoic. So stoicism is one thing, but these are micro elements of what is called enlightenment in the East, where state of no thought is on demand and almost perpetual, right? And a major way of existing. So I believe this is going to be the next station in psychoanalysis, the station of state of no thought, which we call enlightenment.
So when we are referring to this
Uh,
state,
I think
it's
uh, uh, I think we'll have to create a new session. It's showing 1 minute.
okay. So we'll be continuing for the new session. Thank you, Mr. Vedya. It was a delight to unravel an esoteric area. Will be a pleasure to continue discussion on an equally. We'll be continuing the discussion in the other